Alright guys, hope you're doing really well. It's great to be here on an actual video instead of giving out worksheets, which I hope you've enjoyed those worksheets. I basically made a written summary for you guys so that way I could explain all of the context, and it seems based upon all your answers and feedback when it comes to the actual assignments, you did indeed get it. Today I want to focus on kind of summarizing Jacksonian America and give you a little bit of a prelude of the things to come in the United States. I'm basically going to go through presidents 7 through 10 in 15 minutes, so let's get a rockin'. So the age of Jackson. So Andrew Jackson is a very influential president. There's a reason why, and if I was in the classroom, I'd take a $20 bill and I'd show you Andrew Jackson. There's a reason why our country put him on the $20 bill. There's just way too much that went on to his presidency that impacted the United States today. So it all started when Monroe resigned after his second term. Again, I'm kind of reviewing the things from the worksheet to make sure you guys got it. The election of 1824 became a much heated competition between Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Short summary, nobody got the majority of electoral votes. And whenever that happens, it goes into the House of Representatives and they simply vote. In theory, the House of Representatives will go based on what their population says. So in theory, the person who got the popular vote should win that election because the representatives ultimately are a byproduct of us. However, a corrupt bargain happened when the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, threw in his influence as being the Speaker of the House to get Quincy Adams elected, as you saw from the diary of John Quincy Adams. Now, you're probably wondering why the Speaker of the House would do something like that, and could they do something like that? Well, the would is simple because Henry Clay got a promotion out of it. The could is also simple because the Speaker of the House is in charge of the House of Representatives. But Jackson would be back, and in the next election he would win and become the 7th President of the United States. So, in that election, there was no four candidates nonsense. The guy who probably should have been the 6th president actually became the president. And when it came to his presidency, he was known as the common man's president. Someone who came from rags to riches. He wasn't the richest guy in Virginia like a George Washington. He didn't own like Monticello like Thomas Jefferson. He wasn't some guy who had this legacy when it came to being a founding father. This guy was just an average Joe, a guy from rags to riches who went from a horrible background, where in the sense that his parents went through tragedy, he saw his own brother's death, and he made something out of himself through adversity. And his presidency would change a lot of things that our presidencies have since been like during this time. Like the first was one of his famous quotes, "To the victory goes the spoil," which means that Jackson replaced all of his government officials with his campaign supporters, which is what presidents do today. What does that ultimately mean, Mr. Shoens? Well, if you remember civics from last year, the president doesn't do his job by himself. It's way too much stuff for one person to do. He has a cabinet. Prior to Andrew Jackson, pretty much presidents just chose the most qualified person for the job, even if that person was someone that they didn't like. See John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson to put it in perspective. Andrew Jackson's like, no, I got to work with people that I actually like, and thus he picked cabinet members that were of his own choice. Every president has done that since. And to put it in perspective, President Trump has done that, as well as former President Barack Obama did that. They don't just choose the most qualified candidates anymore. They choose qualified candidates, but they ultimately pick people that they like. And that's something Andrew Jackson impacted with his presidency. Now, not all of Andrew Jackson's presidency was good things. There was obviously the conflict over land with the Trail of Tears, the famous, infamous Indian Removal Act, which relocated the Cherokees, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, and various Native American tribes to the Indian Territory, which is now modern-day Oklahoma. Now, that Trail of Tears was obviously very, very saddening, as you guys read. I mean, people looked at this and it's like, man, I've seen battles before. I've seen like my friends die in front of me. This is worse. So, obviously a huge negative from Andrew Jackson. Although, to be fair to Andrew Jackson, President signs laws. He doesn't create them. So, to put in perspective, the legislative branch was on board as well. But also you learned about the situation about Andrew Jackson going against the Supreme Court. You learned a little bit about the removal process of the tribes, whether it be the Choctaws, whether it be the Cherokees, all that different stuff. It was a very dark time with the Trail of Tears, and I hope you guys kind of realize that. But nonetheless, whether it's good or bad, this did make Andrew Jackson well known in the sense that, again, there's a reason he's on our $20 bill. Just too much stuff happened in his presidency to not honor him in some historical sense. Then you had a situation like the Nullification Crisis, where you learned that because of a tariff that was trying to be passed in our country, the South basically outright said, hey, we're going to leave because we don't agree with this whatsoever. To put it in perspective, this isn't the first time states have said, hey, we don't like this and we're going to nullify it. If you remember back in third quarter, that's what Kentucky and Virginia did with that Alien Sedition Act under John Adams' presidency. So this idea of the states leaving goes back all the way back there, but it got infinitely worse during this nullification crisis and ultimately gets the worst right before the Civil War. And you had a whole bunch going into it. You had John C. Calhoun, which was a big proponent for the South to nullify those tariffs. That's Andrew Jackson's own vice president. In the eyes of Andrew Jackson, he was a traitor, kind of like, Finn from Star Wars, which is kind of why John C. Calhoun was not his vice president in the next presidential election, but that's a different story. South Carolina succeeds, though, but the biggest point is Andrew Jackson doesn't let them leave. He was like, if you try to leave, I'm sending the military in, and don't mess with me. I'm the best general we've ever had. As far as statistically battles, I know George Washington is very important, but you get the idea. That speaks volumes. You'll see this when we get to President number 15, Buchanan. If Buchanan hadn't done the strong arm approach that Andrew Jackson did, there's a really good chance the Civil War would have been either delayed or outright avoided. Because at the end of the day, Andrew Jackson threatened South Carolina, and South Carolina backed off, thinking like, oh man, I don't got this. I do not want to be invaded. Trust, don't want to do it. So Andrew Jackson, again, so much went on during his presidency. Then you got the Bank War of the United States, which is something Andrew Jackson wanted to be known for as his most important achievement. So we had a Bank of the United States, and the charter for it, which is basically like a contract, was up. And many people liked that bank. However, Andrew Jackson really didn't like that bank. And to be fair, most Democratic Republicans didn't like the bank, and also Democrats now that the Democratic Republicans are gone. There was a charter that was passed in the House of Representatives and the Senate to renew the bank because after wars and currency devaluation stuff, people thought that it was too important to get rid of it. And Andrew Jackson blatantly vetoed it. It was unheard of for presidents to blatantly veto stuff. In fact, Andrew Jackson vetoed more than most of the other presidents combined. And that's something that impacts America today. It's not uncommon for a president to just veto what they don't like. That happens pretty much in every presidency. But it started with Andrew Jackson. So, bottom line is, Andrew Jackson had so much going on, and I could keep going on about the life of Andrew Jackson, but I hope that kind of gives you an idea of the importance of Andrew Jackson, at least of a historical sense, because there's four big things that impact from his presidency to us in 2020. But at the end of the day, eventually it ends. Jackson retires, respecting what George Washington established, 2 terms, no more. And as vice president of his second term, Martin Van Buren will win the election because a lot of people loved Andrew Jackson. So it's like, why not pick his vice president? It's kind of like the current situation with politics where it's like, hey, we have a Democratic nominee who was the vice president over Obama. A lot of people liked Obama, so why not throw the dice on his vice president? Martin Van Buren will not be successful at all compared to Andrew Jackson. He will be a one-term president. Part of it wasn't Martin Van Buren's fault. Long story short, there's going to be an economic crisis called the Panic of 1837, which basically was a result of the Bank of the United States being discontinued. Could it have been avoided? Yes, but Martin Van Buren didn't react to it accordingly. And thusly, he's going to be a one-term president. When the economy goes down, the president tends to get the blame. And thusly, in the election of 1840, you see the ninth president of the United States, William Henry Harrison. At that point, Jacksonian America is over. The Whigs are in power at that point, not the Democrats. But as you've learned in the past, it's not like William Henry Harrison is going to do a whole lot, which is why it's like I'm not going to bother with any notes on this section. This is all stuff you've learned. His presidency will not last long because he gives a really impressive speech during a basically sleet, frozen tundra conditions of Washington, D.C., but he'll forever be immortalized in the memes of the future. I personally like this one. President William Henry Harrison had a more successful first 100 days of his presidency, yet he was dead for 69 of them. It's like, oh man, that's tough. That's tough. Then John Tyler will take over as 10th president of the United States because he was his vice president. But at the end of the day, I hope this is a good summary for you guys on the importance of Andrew Jackson, historically speaking. Now you have an assignment where you have to write about this whole section, so make sure you do that and turn it in to turnitin.com. Tomorrow we're going to be starting our next section of this unit, so Jacksonian America was one part of it. Now we're going to move on to something known as westward expansion. We're going to specifically talk about the Oregon Trail tomorrow. Anywho, do your assignment. Have fun.